Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having me here today. I'm going to talk about a topic that is very close to my heart. I come to this as an academic with also 25 years of experience in educational and clinical settings, but also I'm going to talk about neurodivergent students, and I have been one of them many years ago. So today I will invite us to think of emotional triggers and associated burdens experienced by adolescents in mainstream schools who have a diagnosis or traits of autism, ADHD, or both. Oops, yeah. So evidentially, in every measure across the lifespan, life outcomes for neurodivergent people are on average significantly poorer than those who are not autistic, who don't have ADHD. There is a sense that the current dominant disorder paradigm does not drive innovation in the ways we work with neurodivergent people, as well as the ways we do research with them. I want us to think that, for example, out of the population of teenagers who are suicidal, 30 to 35% do have a diagnosis of ADHD. And when we think of autistic students by the age of 12, they are 28 times at higher risk to be suicidal or to die from suicide. Now, a traditional disorder paradigm assumes that, for example, you have ADHD, you have dysfunction with frontal limbic brain axis, assumes a deficit within, and that can cause emotion regulation, and that can cause depression, and sometimes can have lethal consequences. With our team at Restart, we have been very interested in understanding emotion regulation and emotion dysregulation. And we are working with young autistic people and young ADHD people, or people with both diagnoses, and students to understand how we can measure, how we can understand emotion regulation, how we can measure it, and how we can cut down the risk of depression for these students in school. And what we found out is that accounts linking emotion regulation or dysregulation with autism and ADHD are very much based in this kind of model, the disorder paradigm model. But also the tools that we have to measure emotion regulation are very often the items that we have on external adult observations, typically assuming a deficit within the person. And all the tools we have are made by and for non-neurodivergent people when they measure emotion. I'll share a few more professional and academic observations because I want us to think of the narrative and what's happening around the lives of those people in order to understand as well their emotion. So, in terms of epistemology, when 10 years ago I started my PhD, I noticed that very often we do research on people. When I was working for people. How much do we see neurodivergent young people as experts of their own lives? Do we research with them? Do we work with them? Do we understand their concepts and how they define emotion regulation or resilience and all these concepts that we kind of have predefined? And then there is a tyranny sometimes of the quantitative. Numbers are good, numbers are helpful, scores can give us a good idea of what might be happening. And of course, big population research studies are really useful to give us the big picture. But sometimes also numbers simplify the complexity of the human existence. And at times, these scores might deny agency and might not help us to contextualize what might really be happening and how people might be really feeling and why and how and in what context. What about the environment around them that might be creating some of these feelings? I want us also to think of, given that I told you there are devastating data about people with ADHD, autism, or both diagnoses, I want us to think, how do people become what they are? Well, from a very young age, we are shown who we are, what we are, in the relationships with others, in the way the world speaks about us. I grew up in Greece. And in Greece, neurodivergency, particularly autism, is signified with the labyrinth that you can see on my slide. So basically, Ariadne is pulling the thread, to navigate the labyrinth, to kill the monster, the autism, right? In Anglo-Saxonic countries, we have the puzzle. So the puzzle, the mystery, there's always something missing. In America and nowadays in Europe as well, people light it blue, assuming again that neurodivergent people are mostly boys, are mostly white, are mostly middle class, and that could explain why so many women have been undiagnosed until much later in life. So I just want us to pay attention and maybe silently reflect for yourselves what narratives shape neurodivergent people's deepest narratives about themselves. How do you speak in your school, in your profession? What about neurodivergent people? What are the first words that come in your mind when you think of autism and ADHD? Think of disorder, you think of problem, you think of dysregulation, you think of superpower. And recently, so much around in society, there is so much about AI. And really good colleagues, Monique Botha and some other colleagues, did a really interesting study where they asked AI a specific, one or two specific engines in AI. They put autism, show me a person with autism, show me an autistic person. And these are the kinds of images you can see. Dark and gloomy and tragedy and chaos and people crying. Of course, it's a boy. Of course, it's white. So again, think of that narrative and the potential impact it can have. What is it like to be autistic or have ADHD in a society that assumes tragedy? And then with my research team at UCL, at the group for research in relationships and neurodiversity, we're using lots of photo voice and other creative methodologies. And we're asking young people who attend schools and colleges, with or without a learning disability, to tell us about their sense of belonging, to tell us about their personal construct of well-being. How do they experience themselves? And they talk about how important it is to have friends, the different things that annoy them in the environment, all the fluffy and other sensory stuff that they like, and lots of reports about video games as well. They also talk about lack of belonging, about a sense of not being accepted. And I will let you read that quote from a 15-year-old girl who is autistic with ADHD and is attending a mainstream school. She used clay on the photo that you see here in order to express what's happening for her at school. And you can see how she feels separated and broken and away from the group for most of the time and for most of the years when she's at school. And then research papers, again, what kind of language do we use in science when we describe neurodivergent people? I have highlighted some words for you: deficit, disorder, difficulties. Lack of emotionality or lack of understanding the other, impaired auditory perception, impaired speech perception. Again, a narrative that assumes tragedy and deficit within the person. But when we ask people in a project we did again at UCL called Flow Unlocked, looking at the relationships that neurodivergent people were missing during the lockdowns and how they were related with others post-lockdowns, they spoke about the level of love and empathy they have about others, to the point that they need to shut down at times because of too much empathy, how much they want to write poems about their friends and talk about friendships, about the injustice of the world, advocating for others, and so on. So again, you can see the paradox here and the difference in the narratives. Recently, there are calls in the scientific community of adopting a new narrative about neurodevelopment of people with differences, with cognitive differences, with differences on how they see the world. And Edmondson Nuka-Bark, who's an excellent collaborator from King's, has a fantastic paper, and he's suggesting reasons beyond the ideological and ethical reasons, scientific reasons on why we could consider flipping the narrative, shifting from disorder to difference, and how this may be helpful, and how this may be a new tool then to measure things differently, to understand things differently, and to intervene and find new solutions. There are many other reasons, and I could talk forever, but I will not, on why we can challenge that core assumptions. Astle et al., you will have access to the slides, are explaining in this paper on how difficult it is to talk about core traits per disability, per divergency, per neurodisorder, whatever you call it. And even when we try to put people in groups, they can be grouped in so many different ways, because chances are most of us will be multiply neurodivergent. Maybe autism and ADHD will coexist, autism and epilepsy will coexist, ADHD and dyspraxia may coexist, and dyslexia and dyscalculia and all of these. And all the different groupings we can have in our students in this specific research and few more projects, actually they do not map one another, and they do not always predict the learning outcomes or the well-being outcomes of the students. Challenging the deficit assumption as well is becoming more, there are bigger calls for challenging the deficit assumption because of the research evidence of the last 10 years. So Catherine Crompton from University of Edinburgh did a fantastic experiment. They had a group of autistic people without learning disability, a group of non-autistic people without learning disability, and they did different experiments in terms of communication and transferring information. Can you guess which group scored higher in terms of accuracy, doing the job better and quicker? It was the autistic group, actually. So, you know, when we have autistic people, when we have neurodivergent people working on their own, doing the thing, actually, they might even be at times better in terms of cognitive and other skills compared to neurotypical people. Well, the chaos started in the experiment, and sometimes it does happen in real life, when you mix neurotypes. And none of the groups were efficient anymore. People were messing up the information, and they were not performing well. There is much more research that is challenging as well the theory of mind, the lack of theory of mind. The autistic people are not connected with their emotions, or are not connected with the emotions of other people and stuff like that. So there are, apart from the scientific, there are also cultural critiques, and this is this slide is making us think as well of how the neurodisorder narrative can dehumanize people, because it identifies all the disorder, all the problem in themselves. It limits us to think about what we can do in the environment, and it limits us into thinking of these humans mostly in negative terms, in pathologizing, in clinical and in medicalized terms. It alienates people. It doesn't pay too much attention on the personal experience. How do they make sense of their life? How do they make sense of the environment? What do they need to connect with others? It very often does stigmatize. So many kids from a young age, but many adults, are not going to disclose disability in the workplace or at university or at school. Everybody is scared of the prejudice, the discrimination, and of course these people are much more, neurodivergent people are much more prone to victimization. And it does remove the agency, because once you're broken, you need to be fixed, right? Once you have a disorder, you need to be fixed. In the eyes of teachers, in the eyes of the others who are working with you. So that was the first part. I just wanted to share these thoughts with you and think, if any impact, what kind of impact they could have in terms of how you are measuring emotion, how you're working with neurodivergent people in schools. Now, in terms of the second part of presentation, I'm going to present you some data, very, very fresh data that we have with a team called Restar, on how we work to reduce the risk of adolescent depression with neurodivergent people. We're shifting the narrative. We accept, from a neurodiversity perspective, the neurobiological reality of neurological differences of those with ADHD, autism, or both. We reject the concept of disorder and we emphasize on the impact of the environment, on the emotion regulation, on the emotional lives of autistic and ADHD people, recognizing the impact of the emotional burden. And I will tell you about some research we're doing that is actually showing us that autistic ADHD or those with a dual diagnosis at school are experiencing more intense and more frequent triggers. And this kind of triggers could tell a lot about why people then may appear to others or indeed feel dysregulated. A neurodiversity perspective, shifting from neurodisorder to neurodiversity, also promotes dignity, self-determination, and solidarity. It looks to accommodate the differences. It brings curiosity to understand on the different ways people get regulated or dysregulated, and the differences and the variability on expressing emotion in the school environment. And it does privilege the personal experience. So much of what I'm going to present you is grounded in what we call in our team an experience-sensitive approach. So we want to understand their lived experience of suffering. We see dysregulation as a stress response to what the environment is bringing to people. And sometimes most of the tools, the mainstream tools that we have, most of the mainstream tools that we have to measure emotionality look at the deficit within. They don't look at what is happening around the person and how this might upset the person. So we reimagine ADHD and autism translational science from a neurodiversity perspective. So remember what I showed you earlier about how if you have autism or ADHD, you're more prone basically because of your brain structure to have depression. Let's look at a slightly different formulation. We worked with many young people as participants. We had 96 interviews. We have 700 people working on cross-sectional and longitudinal studies with us. And we have 10 young neurodivergent young people as co-researchers. They are fully on board with everything we do in our academic team, and 10 youth advisors. So we're learning from them that actually they're having more numerous, more intense, and longer lasting upsetting experiences at the school environment. They're facing more challenging encounters, and they feel that the whole setting is challenging their whole existence at times. And that leads to chronic stress, could explain the low sense of self-worth, the high levels of ruminations that these people are actually experiencing. And that's kind of a pathway that we see towards depression. And then once they get depressed, they're more isolated, they have less capacity to regulate emotion. And that leads to not asking for support, to have reduced ability to ask for support. The less they regulate themselves, the more they get in trouble with school staff, the more they deal with the difficulty of the upsetness and the stressful environment, and so on. So what do we do? Whoops. What do we do? We are trying then to think of how we can adapt the setting, how we can train the members of staff as well as students themselves in new ways, but they're not neuronormative ways. So we might not necessarily ask them to do mindfulness or to check their breathing, although these things may be useful for some, but we're also looking to understand from their experience, the way they understand the world differently due to the different cognition, how we can find new ways to support them to have more agency to manage their emotions, how we can increase support and self-advocacy, how we can create kinder relationships, a stronger sense of belonging, and adapt settings. So basically, the one thing I would like you to remember is that it's really important when we're measuring well-being at schools to understand that neurodivergent people with or without a learning disability are exposed to higher levels of emotional burden. And this is crucial in terms of then how we formulate the problem, in terms of what kind of goals then we want to achieve. And in terms of prioritizing, who do we want to fix, the person or the environment? Currently, we are testing the concept of emotional burden. We are about to publish a paper, and maybe I'll put in the chat some links as well, so you can see some of the you can have access to the preprints. Cross-sectionally, we're testing a new tool to measure emotion regulation. It's called MESSI. And it's measuring common upsetting experiences. MESSI stands for My Emotions and Me in school, or something like that. And all the items, it has 24 items. It started with 50 items. We piloted, we reduced it, we checked their psychometric properties. And all the items come from accounts of 69 people that we had interviewed. So the themes from their interviews became items that we co-established with young neurodivergent people, and then we tested the psychometric properties, and we resumed into a tool that has 24 items. And you can see he's asking, instead of asking about internal stuff about emotion dysregulation, is asking about specific events and specific experiences at school that young people themselves told us are really, really important and are continuously happening and affecting their mood. I'm not going to get too much into the statistics, but it's really important to say that when we test cross-sectionally with over 700 students from across the country, we saw massive overlap in terms of the ADHD and the autism experience. There were few but interesting differences. So you can see that those with ADHD, they feel less listened often. They find things more boring. They find that people interrupt them more often from the things that they want to do or they want to say. They often lose and forget things. They're always told that they're naughty or they need to try harder, and they get lots of labels like that. They often feel a sense of injustice, that they're accused for no reason, and they often feel that having too many options can also be very confusing. Those who are autistic, they spoke more about the social aspect of the difficulty of having peers gossiping about them, about feeling unsafe in unexpected situations, feeling sensory discomfort, feeling that they are rushed to do things, feeling that others don't understand them, that others don't empathize with them. And very, very often they are being teased and bullied, and they have a pressure to mask and to do well and to be good so that they can be accepted. I'm going to talk now briefly about some of the qualitative data we have found and and the methodology we used when it comes to asking questions and interviewing people. There was a danger that we would come with concepts that pre-exist a priori and put our assumptions in the questions. So instead of asking questions people, we gave them few prompts to bring artwork, poems, Lego, clay, modeling, to express what are the triggers of emotion dysregulation in their perspective. And you can see that a common theme was social dislocation, alienation, and conflict. We had more than 850 quotes on that from the 69 people we interviewed. So there is all of them, all the students with autism, ADHD, or both, reported social unease during interactions with others, as well as when they are excluded from these interactions at school. They spoke about how this is creating very negative feelings about themselves, very low self-worth. They spoke about the fact that they're losing hope. They feel losers, but also they feel they have nothing good to expect from others. And they don't really expect that something is going to change unless they try to hide parts of themselves, and I'll come back to that. So being lonely at school is a common ongoing experience, and the feeling of not being accepted and not belong. And paradoxically, they are talking about the fact that they are very ignored until they start getting loads of attention because of their diagnosis at times, from members of staff, for a learning support assistant that might be on their case, or for a student that picks up on their disability. Or because eventually they will have an outburst. They are going to be very dysregulated, and that doesn't work. You can see some group differences. Those who are autistic, they speak more about the lack of sense of belonging. Those with ADHD, they gave really painful accounts on being victimized, on being on unsafe and provoking interruptions that can be really, really upsetting. And here you can see a sample of artwork and a quote. The next thing, when we asked people what are the top key dysregulating, upsetting experiences at school, they spoke about the fact that they felt that they had to hide their true self. They spoke about suppression of a whole range of emotions. And what was interesting, it was that these looked then to members of staff as regulation. So they said that they're feeling more accepted, and they are more accepted indeed in their experience when they're hiding their natural feelings, their preferences, their reactions, and they are super worried of being misunderstood and further excluded. That was a shared concern across both groups. Now, it had slightly different functions. Autistic people spoke about how they want to protect others from their feelings. How interesting is that? The empathy that they're showing, and how that sits with the lack of theory of mind, kind of dominant theories. And then those with ADHD, they said that the key function of hiding myself is to protect myself from the consequences. People are very harsh, people are punishing them or putting loads of labels on them. People said that they have been called dramatic, a crying baby, they have been asked consistently to behave, and so on. And I'll let you see a little bit of art, a sample of artwork again, and some quotes. So this accumulation of feelings, it does have a Coca-Cola effect eventually, and people get dysregulated. And they connected a lot that theme of hiding their self with rage, with very low mood and sadness. Next and last theme is, no, it's not the last, actually, it's the third one. They spoke a lot about internalized self-doubt, loathing, and embarrassment. So they did indeed say that they have loads of negative thoughts, but these negative thoughts are not because of a within deficit or because of the autistic or ADHD way of thinking. In their view, these negative thoughts are very context dependent, and they're very much justified by the experience they have at school. So they talked about how hard it is for them to keep up with neurotypical expectations, and how this is triggering feelings of sadness, apathy, or anger. And they said that it's not the way I think, but it's the way I am taught to believe about myself due to repeated experiences that confirm that I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough, I'm broken, I don't fit in. And that very often is related with feelings of being over-worried, catastrophizing, self-doubting, and even self-hate for many of our participants. Many of them were saying, what's the point to try? People already think what they think about me. And that makes them actually feeling extremely triggered. And the fear of reliving negative interaction, of re-experiencing negative interactions, is having almost a trauma response. So people might be very irritable, but might be very hyper vigilant about what's happening in different interactions. And many of them spoke about sticky feelings of anger when they are around others. And very often, these are only interpreted by school staff as being naughty, being out of control. Give you a moment again with a sample of quotes and sample of artwork that young people submitted to us. And the final thing, stimulation levels and sensory mismatch. So they spoke a lot about sensory input and the stimulation levels in the classrooms, in the corridors. I can't tell you how many accounts we have about PE and lunchrooms. But if you are professionals in the field, probably that's not new to you. You may have experienced or observed that. Basically, they spoke about how much harder it is to regulate senses at school compared to home, and how that is creating very negative experiences, meltdowns and shutdowns. When it comes to the autistic participants, they spoke about desperately looking for moments of agency to reduce stimulation. And those with ADHD, they mostly spoke about unpleasant interactions that are boring, and they're interrupting their the flow of their conversation or whatever they're on, and often feeling understimulated. It's really interesting that both groups said that when others are trying to help them in terms of sensory ways, they don't attune with their sensory needs, but they assume. So they have very much one size fits all sensory toys or sensory interventions that might not really match their profile. And again, I'll let you see a sample of artwork and quotes related to that theme. This is a paper under review, so keep an eye, it's going to come out soon. So for the Restart team, our research team, this piece of work, it has been an adventure in paradigm flipping, and we have a paper under review that is looking at the cross-sectional evidence from a little bit more than 700 students on how MESI, our new tool, can be used in terms of helping us measure emotion at school and understanding the common upsetting experiences and their impact on people's mood. This is coming out, but also we have already a preprint available, and I'll put it on the chat, where you can see the protocol for the longitudinal studies. So the cross-sectional studies are proving that the emotional burden is indeed a very important concept. And it does make sense to acknowledge it and to measure it. But we want to see longitudinally what is stronger, cognitive, common traditional factors that we're measuring, or the emotional burden in terms of how people get at higher risk of developing depression. So shifting from disorder to diversity, listening from young people themselves, is actually challenging the uniformity and the deficit narrative that we have when we think of emotional distress, and is begging for the question to understand more about what is the role of emotional burden cross-sectionally and longitudinally, something that we already do in our teams, and we're very happy to start sharing with different schools. And then it does enrich the process, really. We can use whatever measure we're using, but it's also really important to use creative and open approaches so that we can understand from the personal accounts of young people themselves. They can bring pre-recordings, they can bring photography, they can bring clay modeling or logo modeling, they can write poems, and we can understand their perspectives. And these highlight the diversity of environmental adversities that they're facing in the school context. And I think that when we do that, then the impact of our intervention or our translational science work or the goals that we're establishing with students, when we involve them, when we co-establish ideas, tools, and methods with neurodivergent people, we maximize the possibilities for whatever we do to have a greater real life impact, because it does relate to the areas and to the ways that they have chosen for themselves. Massive, I just want to acknowledge the work of my colleagues and the fantastic work the youth and the professional academics, researchers in this project have done. And you can see many of the academic folks that we work together here. And that's it, I think, today.